The day Evelyn Easton rode into Coldwater Creek, Texas, the sky was the color of a bruise, purple and low and threatening, and everyone who watched her come down the main road agreed later that they had never seen a woman look so simultaneously lost and deliberate in all their lives. It was the autumn of 1878, when the Kishome Trail was still alive with the last great cattle drives, when the Texas Rangers were a fact of life rather than legend, and when a small cattle town like Coldwater Creek could either make a person or swallow them whole without so much as a belch to mark the occasion. The town sat in a shallow valley between two limestone ridges, its single main street flanked by a general store, a feed merchant, a saloon called the Dusty Boot, a church that had been half-finished for 3 years, and a post office that doubled as the sheriff's office when the sheriff was sober enough to sit upright behind the desk. Evelyn Easton was 26 years old, and she arrived with a single carpet bag, a horse she had borrowed from her uncle in San Antonio, and was fully planning to return once she figured out where she was going, and approximately $4.30 in honest coin. She had brown hair the color of creek mud after a good rain, eyes so dark they looked black when she was tired, which was most of the time, and hands that were already roughened from work in ways that most women in polite society would have taken pains to hide. Evelyn did not hide her hands. She did not have time for that kind of vanity. She had come to Coldwater Creek because her cousin, a woman named Martha Peel who had married a dry goods merchant, had written her a letter 3 months prior saying that there was work to be had and that the town was decent enough for a woman on her own. Martha had failed to mention, or perhaps had simply not known, that the work she'd been alluding to, a position as a seamstress's assistant, had been filled 2 weeks before Evelyn's letter of inquiry even arrived. So Evelyn rode in with the plan of a seamstress's assistant and found herself instead standing in front of the general store with nothing at all lined up, and the cold wind coming down off the ridge like it wanted to make a point. It was old Pete Grayson, the feed merchant, who first mentioned the name. He was a round-shouldered man in his 60s with a mustache like a gray caterpillar, and he told her without much ceremony that if she was looking for work and wasn't afraid of hard going, she ought to talk to Harlan Dalton out at the Spur and Stone Ranch, because Harlan Dalton needed help badly and nobody in town was willing to give it to him. Why not? Evelyn asked. She was practical by nature, and cutting to the center of things was simply how she operated. Pete Grayson sucked at his teeth. Because Harlan Dalton is what you'd call difficult, he said. Lost his wife 2 years back. Lost most of his cattle last spring to a sickness that went through the herd. Lost 2 ranch hands in the same month when they got fed up and moved on. Man's been sitting out there on that property alone, and he ain't been right since any of it happened. People have tried. Women from the church tried bringing food. Sheriff Briggs rode out twice to check on him. Harlan sent everybody away. What kind of work does he need done? Evelyn asked. Cooking, cleaning, maybe helping with the books if you can write. He can't run the place alone, and he knows it, but knowing a thing and accepting help for it are 2 entirely different animals. Evelyn looked down the main street and then back at Pete Grayson. She thought about her $4.30. She thought about Martha's spare bedroom, which was the size of a generous closet and smelled persistently of camphor. She thought about riding all the way back to San Antonio and telling her uncle she had failed, which was something she had no intention of doing. Which way is the Spur and Stone Ranch? She said. Pete Grayson pointed. The road out to the Spur and Stone Ranch was 3 miles of rutted caliche track that wound through cedar and live oak, and by the time Evelyn came over the last rise and saw the property below her, the sky had opened just enough to let one thin shaft of pale gold light through the clouds, and it landed on the ranch house like an afterthought. The house itself was solid limestone and cedar, built to last, but it had the look of a place that had stopped being cared for. The porch boards were warped. One shutter hung at an angle. The fence that ran along the near pasture had 2 sections down. The yard between the house and the barn was thick with dried weeds, and the barn door was held shut with a length of rope rather than the iron latch that had clearly once been there. But the land itself was something. Even in the early autumn, even with the grass going brown at the tips, even with the creek running low after a dry summer, the land had a quality to it that made Evelyn understand immediately why someone had built a life here. The limestone ridges cupped the valley in a way that felt almost protective. The live oaks were old and massive. There was a quality of silence out here that was not emptiness but something more like depth. She rode down the rise and into the yard and pulled her horse up near the porch, and she sat there for a moment before she got down, because something told her to be still and careful. The door opened before she had finished tying her horse to the porch rail. The man who came out was not what she had expected, though she could not have said exactly what she had expected. Harlan Dalton was perhaps 32, tall and angular in the way of men who had worked hard their whole lives and eaten irregularly for the past year or two, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in at least a week. He wore a worn canvas coat over a collarless shirt, and his boots were good boots, expensive once, now cracked at the toe. His eyes were the gray-green of sage after rain, and they looked at Evelyn with an expression that she recognized immediately, because she had seen it in her own mirror during the worst stretch of the year her father had died. It was the expression of a person who had run out of the particular energy it takes to pretend everything is fine. "I don't know you," he said. His voice was low and flat, not unfriendly exactly, but with no warmth in it either, the way a stone wall is not unfriendly. "My name is Evelyn Easton," she said. "Pete Grayson at the feed store said you might be in need of help." Harlan Dalton looked at her for a long moment. "Pete Grayson ought to mind his own affairs," he said. "That's probably true," Evelyn agreed, "but since he didn't, here I am." Something shifted almost imperceptibly in his face. "I don't need help." Evelyn glanced at the broken fence section. She glanced at the weeds in the yard. She glanced at the hanging shutter and then back at him. She did not say anything about any of those things. "I need work," she said. "I can cook. I can clean. I can do accounts if you have ledgers. I won't bother you beyond what the work requires, and I won't offer opinions on how you run your own business. I'm asking for room and board and $2 a week." He stared at her. $2 a week, he repeated. "Room and board and $2 a week," she said again. "If at the end of the first 2 weeks you decide it isn't working, I'll go without argument." Harlan Dalton leaned against the door frame and looked out at the yard and then at the road she had come in on, and she could see him turning the proposition over in his mind the way you turn a rock over to see what's living underneath it. "There's a room off the kitchen," he said finally. "Small. No window." "I've slept in worse," she said truthfully. He stepped back from the door, which she took as an invitation, and she untied her carpet bag from the saddle and followed him inside. The interior of the house told the same story as the exterior, but with more detail. It was clean in the sense that there was no filth, but it had the particular disorder of a place where someone had stopped seeing it. Dishes were stacked unevenly. The kitchen table held a half-finished harness repair job and 2 empty tin cups and a folded newspaper from 4 months ago. The fireplace had a cold ash bed that had not been cleaned in a while. But the furniture was good, solid pieces. A table built to seat 6 people, chairs made by someone who knew joinery, a shelf of books beside the fireplace that had been put there by someone who cared about reading. Harlan Dalton showed her the room off the kitchen. It was small and dark as promised, but it had a cot with a wool blanket and a nail on the wall for hanging things and a floor that didn't creak too badly, and Evelyn set her carpet bag down and decided it was enough. "Supper," she said, turning back to him. "Is there food in the larder?" "Some," he said. She found dried beans, a heel of cornmeal, salt pork, and 2 potatoes going slightly soft. She found coffee and a decent iron pot. She made a bean and pork stew that was plain but hot and filling, and she baked cornbread in the Dutch oven while Harlan Dalton sat at the kitchen table and watched her work with an expression that she could not quite read, somewhere between wariness and something more fragile than wariness. He ate everything she put in front of him. He ate it quickly, which told her he'd been eating poorly, and he mopped the bowl with the cornbread and set it down and said, "That's the first hot meal I've had in 3 weeks." Evelyn did not respond to that. She understood instinctively that remarking on it would make him feel worse, not better. She just said, "I'll need to go into town tomorrow for supplies if I'm to keep the larder stocked. I'll give you a list of what to charge to my account at Grayson's," he said. And that was the beginning of it, as simple and unromantic as a bowl of bean stew. The first week was composed almost entirely of Evelyn working and Harlan Dalton watching her work from a distance with a wariness that she had decided from the start not to fight against. She understood something that the church women who'd brought food and the sheriff who'd ridden out twice had apparently not understood, which was that a person who had shut themselves down the way Harlan Dalton had shut himself down could not be coaxed open with kindness. Kindness was just another form of pressure when you were that raw, and what Harlan Dalton needed, she sensed almost from the first day, was not someone who pushed or prodded or offered sympathies or expressed concern. What he needed was someone who simply showed up and did not leave. So she showed up, and she did not leave. She cleaned the kitchen properly on the first day. On the second day, she cleaned the ash from the fireplace and laid a new fire, and washed the dishes that had accumulated. On the third day, she took a broom to the porch and swept the dead leaves and dust away, and straightened the hanging shutter using a hammer and nail she found in the barn. And she did it without telling him she was going to do it or asking his permission. She simply did it. On the fourth day, he came out to the barn when she was feeding the 2 horses he still had, because she had noticed he hadn't gotten to it yet that morning, and he stood in the barn doorway for a moment with his hands in his coat pockets. "You don't have to do the horses," he said. "I know," she said, and kept filling the water trough. He watched her for a moment longer. "Where did you come from?" he asked. "Before San Antonio, I mean." "East Texas," she said. "Small town called Milam County. My father had a farm." "Had," he said, which meant he heard the past tense. "He died 4 years ago," she said. "The farm went to settle debts. My mother had passed the year before that, so after the farm I was on my own for a while before I got settled in San Antonio." He was quiet for a bit, then he said, "I'm sorry about your father." "Thank you," she said. "I'm sorry about your wife." She hadn't planned to say it. It came out because it was the natural exchange. The same weight returned for the same weight, and she watched his face carefully as she said it to see if it was too much. He absorbed it the way a man absorbs a hard wind, by going slightly still and then releasing a slow breath. "Clara," he said. It was just the name, offered without decoration, and Evelyn understood that he had not said it out loud to anyone in a long time. "Clara," she repeated, giving it back to him with the same plainness he'd used, not as a condolence or a softening, just as an acknowledgement that the person had existed and had a name, and the name deserved to be spoken. Harlan nodded once and walked back toward the house, and Evelyn finished watering the horses and did not make anything out of the moment, because making something out of it would have undone it. On the 6th day, she asked him about the ranch ledgers. He brought them out from a roll-top desk in what had been set up as a small office beside the front room. The ledgers were 2 years behind in terms of proper accounting, entries made in an increasingly irregular hand. She sat at the kitchen table with the ledgers and a pencil, and worked through them for 2 evenings while Harlan sat across from her and read from the shelf of books or mended harness, and neither of them spoke much. But it was a comfortable not speaking, the kind that happens when 2 people are simply sharing space rather than avoiding each other. On the 8th day, she found out about the cattle situation in more detail. She had asked about the empty paddocks she had noticed, and Harlan told her, with the economic bluntness of someone who had stopped expecting sympathy, that he had started with 480 head 2 years ago. Texas fever had gone through the herd the previous spring, the tick fever that was wiping out cattle operations across the state, and he had lost over 300 head. He had 80 left, scattered on the back pastures, and 2 ranch hands who had stayed through the fever outbreak had left in June because he couldn't make payroll. "So right now it is just you and 80 head of cattle," Evelyn said. 83, he said. "I counted last week." "And the plan," she said. He looked at her across the kitchen table, and there was a flat exhaustion in his face that was not surrender exactly, but was in the neighborhood of it. "There isn't much of one," he said honestly. "I've been keeping them alive, trying to figure out if I rebuild or sell what's left and be done with it." Evelyn looked at the ledgers. She had been a farm girl, and she knew numbers, and she knew livestock operations, not cattle specifically, but the general mathematics of keeping land alive. How much would it take to buy fresh stock, start building back up from a smaller base? "More than I have." "What about the back pastures, the ones that are empty right now?" "Good grass." "The fever doesn't live in the grass," he said. "It's the ticks. The longhorns we lost were already tick exposed. If I brought in different stock, managed the tick problem with rotation." He stopped talking the way a man stops talking when he realizes he's describing a plan he'd told himself he wasn't going to pursue. "That sounds like it could work," Evelyn said. "It sounds like it costs money I don't have," he said. "You could apply for a loan against the land," she said. "The land is clear, isn't it? No mortgage." Harlan looked at her with a kind of surprised attention, as if he had not expected her to know what a mortgage was. "Clara's family helped us buy it outright," he said. "Then you have collateral," Evelyn said. "The bank in Coldwater Creek, is it a proper bank or just a saloon with a safe?" Despite everything, the corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but it was the ghost of a smile, a muscle memory of what smiling felt like, and it lasted only a second before it was gone, but Evelyn saw it. "It's a proper bank," he said. "Managed by a man named Whitmore. He's fair." "Then that's a conversation worth having," she said. She went back to the ledgers and did not push further. She had planted the seed, and she had learned enough about Harlan Dalton in 8 days to understand that you did not plant a seed and then stand over it demanding it sprout. The town of Coldwater Creek had opinions about Evelyn Easton within approximately 48 hours of her arrival. This was inevitable in a town of 400 people where everyone knew the Spur and Stone Ranch, and had followed Harlan Dalton's decline with the particular mixture of genuine concern and avid interest that small communities apply to their tragedies. When it became known that a young woman from out of town had gone out to the ranch and been taken on as housekeeper, the opinion divided fairly cleanly between those who thought it was sensible and probably good for Harlan, and those who thought it was scandalous and possibly dangerous. Martha Peel, Evelyn's cousin, fell into neither camp because she was primarily concerned and expressed this by meeting Evelyn at Grayson's General Store on Evelyn's second supply run and gripping her arm. "Are you all right out there?" Martha asked. She was a small, worried woman with kind eyes. "People say he's unpredictable." "People say a lot of things," Evelyn said, examining a bolt of muslin. "He's not unpredictable. He's grieving, and he's been alone too long, and his ranch is in trouble." "None of that makes a person dangerous. But do you feel safe?" "Completely," Evelyn said, and meant it. She had never felt anything approaching fear from Harlan Dalton. What she felt from him was a kind of careful distance, the distance of a man who was protecting himself by not letting anything get too close, which was an entirely different thing from danger. The distance was not aimed at her. It was just the radius he lived in. It was in the 3rd week that things began to shift in ways too small to name but too real to ignore. He started talking at supper. Not much, not disclosively, just observations about the weather, about the cattle, about something he'd read in one of his books. He asked her once what books she had read, and she told him she had read the Bible comprehensively, and also a collection of Walter Scott her father had owned, and a copy of Dickens' Oliver Twist that had been lent to her by a schoolteacher in San Antonio. And he went to the shelf by the fireplace and came back with a book she had not heard of, a novel called The House of the Seven Gables by Nathaniel Hawthorne, and set it on the table in front of her without saying anything. She read it in the evenings, and sometimes she would look up and find him watching her read, not in a way that made her self-conscious, but in the way you watch something that you've forgotten could exist, something quiet and alive in your own house. She fixed the fence sections that were down. She found the fence posts in the barn and the wire and the tools, and she went out on a Wednesday morning and started working on it. And by midday Harlan had come out and stood watching her for about 30 seconds before he picked up the post-hole digger and started working beside her. They worked for 3 hours without talking much, and at the end of it the fence line was solid and true, and they walked back to the house in the late afternoon light, and Evelyn thought that this was what recovery looked like at its very beginning. Not a dramatic moment, just two people fixing a fence. She cooked good things. She was not a fancy cook, but she was a thorough and honest one, and the food she made was the kind of food that a working person actually needed, solid and warm and sufficient. She made beef stew when he slaughtered one of the older steers, using every part of the animal that was usable. She made sourdough bread from a starter she got from Martha and kept on the kitchen shelf. She made apple pie from dried apples she found in the larder, and when she set it on the table one Sunday evening, Harlan Dalton went very still for a moment. She knew why without asking. Someone else had made apple pie in that kitchen, a woman named Clara, and the smell of it was the smell of a life that had existed here before everything fell apart. She did not say anything. She cut the pie and put a slice in front of him and cut her own piece and started eating, and after a moment he picked up his fork. "Clara used to make this," he said quietly. "It's a good pie to make," Evelyn said. "Easy enough with dried apples, and you always have them. She used to put a little cinnamon in it," he said. "I'll do that next time," Evelyn said. He looked at her, and there was something in his face that was not quite grief and not quite gratitude and not quite anything she had a word for. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said. "But cinnamon makes it better," he smiled. Not the ghost of a smile this time. A real one, brief and a little rusty with disuse, but present and actual, and Evelyn felt it move through her like sunlight through cold water, and she looked back down at her plate so he would not see what it had done to her face. Because she had been telling herself since the first day that she was here to work. She was here because she needed a job, and he needed help, and that was the whole and entire sum of it. She had not come out to the Spur and Stone Ranch to fall in love with the broken rancher who lived there, and she was a practical woman who knew the difference between feeling sympathy for someone and feeling something more complicated than that. But the smile had not looked like the smile of a man she was employed by. It had looked like the smile of a person who had remembered, just for a second, that they were still alive. She thought about that smile more than she thought it was wise to think about it. In the 5th week, Harlan Dalton rode into town and met with Silas Whitmore at the bank. He had not told Evelyn he was going to do it. He came back in the mid-afternoon and found her in the kitchen doing accounts, and he sat down at the table across from her and he said, "I talked to Whitmore." She looked up. "He'll loan me enough to buy 30 head of good stock," Harlan said. "Not Longhorns, Herefords. They're doing better with the tick issue, something about their hide being less hospitable. They're calmer animals too, easier to manage alone or with minimal help." "That's good news," Evelyn said. "The interest rate is reasonable," he said. He was looking at the table rather than at her, and she understood that he was telling her because he wanted to tell someone and she was who he had. "It'll take 2 years of good seasons to pay it back, might be 3. 2 or 3 years is not forever," she said. He looked up at her then. "No," he said, "it isn't." He went to see a rancher 2 counties east the following week, a man who ran a Hereford operation and was willing to sell 30 head at a price that worked with the loan. The cattle arrived on a Friday in early November, driven up the track by 2 of the selling ranchers' hands, and Harlan stood at the gate of the back paddock and watched them come in with an expression that Evelyn, watching from the porch, thought was the most painfully hopeful thing she had ever seen on a human face. He turned and saw her watching, and she raised her hand in something that wasn't quite a wave, just an acknowledgement, and he raised his hand back, and that small gesture between them, across the yard in the cold November light, felt like more than it was and exactly like what it was at the same time. November deepened. The Texas Hill Country could be mild in winter and could be brutal, and that particular November chose to be brutal, with a norther that came down in the second week and dropped the temperature 30 degrees in a single afternoon. Evelyn spent the cold evening banking the fireplace properly and making sure the draft was right and heating bricks to put under the blankets in both bedrooms. And when she brought the heated brick to Harlan's room, she knocked and left it just inside the door without going further in, and he said from somewhere within, "Thank you, Evelyn." And it was the first time he had used her first name. She stood outside his bedroom door for a moment after he'd said it, just long enough to feel the sound of her name and his voice settle into some part of her she had not known was waiting for it. And then she went to her own room and wrapped herself in her blanket and was sensible and practical, and absolutely did not think about it for hours. He started asking her to ride with him when he went to check on the cattle. This began in early December, when the days were short and cold, and the work was partly about movement and warmth. He would saddle both horses before she was finished with the breakfast dishes, and she would come out to find them ready, and they would ride the back pastures together, checking the herd, checking the water supply, checking the fencing. The Herefords were settling in. They were blocky, calm animals with copper-red coats and white faces, and Evelyn thought they were beautiful in the way that simple, solid things are beautiful. Harlan talked more on horseback than he did anywhere else. Something about the movement and the open air seemed to loosen him in ways that sitting at a table did not. He talked about the land and what it could do in good years. He talked about his father, who had been a cattle man in another part of Texas before Harlan had come west and found this valley. He talked about the books he'd read and what he thought about them, and she talked back, and she discovered that arguing with Harlan Dalton about the merits of various novels was one of the more enjoyable things she had done in years. "You think Hawthorne is too dark," he said one morning, after she told him as much. "I think Hawthorne is dark when he doesn't need to be," she said. "He makes people suffer for the sake of suffering, not because it illuminates anything." "Sometimes suffering doesn't need to illuminate anything," Harlan said. "Sometimes it's just what happens." She looked at him sideways. "I know that's true," she said, "but I still think a story ought to offer you something at the end. Even if life doesn't, especially then," she said. "That's what a story is for." He was quiet for a long stretch, looking out over the pasture and the red cattle moving through the frost-pale grass. Then he said, "That's a hopeful way to think about it." "Are you calling me hopeful as an insult?" she said, and he laughed, actually laughed, a short surprised sound like something had caught him off guard, and she felt the warmth of it in the cold morning air the same way she had felt the warmth of his smile in the kitchen with the apple pie. She was not being practical about this. She knew that. But she had also decided sometime in the past few weeks that being relentlessly practical about everything was a form of cowardice, and cowardice was something she had never allowed herself. Christmas came to Coldwater Creek with a week of mild weather and a community potluck supper at the half-finished church that the town attended with the diligent sociability of people who had very few entertainment options. Evelyn went with Martha and her husband George, and she sat with them through the meal and the singing of hymns and the short sermon from Pastor Yates, who was a good man but had a tendency to mistake length for depth. She was helping stack plates at the end of the evening when she looked up and saw Harlan Dalton standing in the doorway of the church. He was looking for someone, she realized. He was scanning the room. And then he found her, and his face changed in that small way she had learned to watch for, the slight easing that happened when he located something he'd been uncertain he would find, and he walked across the room toward her. "I thought you might come to this," he said. "Did you come to find me?" she asked, and then felt she had been too direct, but he didn't deflect. He looked at her steadily. "I came because it seemed wrong to sit alone on Christmas," he said, "and because you were here." Both of those things were true simultaneously, and she understood that he had said them both on purpose. They sat together for the singing at the end of the evening. in the wooden pew with the cold December air coming through the unfinished sections of the church wall, and their shoulders were touching in the way that shoulders touch when people choose to sit close rather than far apart. And Evelyn sang the hymns she knew, and Harlan did not sing much because he said he couldn't carry a tune, which she discovered was an exaggeration in one direction and an honest assessment in another. He drove her back to the ranch in the wagon rather than her riding with Martha, because he had come in the wagon, and she sat beside him on the wagon bench under a thick wool blanket with the stars very sharp and cold overhead, the kind of stars you only see in Texas in winter, and they talked about nothing in particular, about the potluck food, and about Pastor Yates' sermon, and about whether the church would ever actually be finished. And when the wagon pulled into the yard and they climbed down and she said good night and walked toward the kitchen door, she heard him say her name. She turned. He was still standing by the wagon, his breath making small clouds in the cold air, looking at her with that expression she had stopped trying to translate into words. "Thank you," he said, "for the past 2 months, for everything you've done here." "It's the work I'm paid to do," she said carefully. He shook his head. "You know it isn't only that," he said. She held his gaze for a moment. "I know," she said, just as carefully, just as honestly. She went inside, and she stood in the dark kitchen for a full minute before she lit the lamp. January arrived cold and hard, and with it came trouble in the form of 2 men Evelyn had never seen before. She saw them first from the kitchen window, 2 riders coming down the track in the early morning while Harlan was out checking on the herd. They were not the kind of men that a woman who had grown up in rural Texas needed anyone to explain to her. They sat their horses with the particular ease of men who spent a great deal of time on horseback for professional reasons, and their professional reasons were not ranching. She was at the door when they pulled up to the porch, and she stood in the doorway and looked at them without speaking. The older one, a lean-faced man with a pale scar below his left eye, tipped his hat with the performance of courtesy rather than the substance of it. "Morning, ma'am. We're looking for Harlan Dalton." "He's not here right now," she said. "We'll wait," the younger one said, and started to dismount. "You'll wait on the road," Evelyn said, with the particular tone of voice her mother had used when she was absolutely serious and was not going to repeat herself. "This is private property and Mr. Dalton isn't receiving visitors today." Both men looked at her with the kind of assessment that made her stomach tighten, but she held the door frame and held their gaze and did not move. The older man smiled without warmth. "You just tell him Ray Cutter came by," he said. "He'll know the name." They turned their horses and went back up the track, and Evelyn stood at the door until they were out of sight, and then she let out a slow breath and went to find Harlan. He was in the north pasture, and she rode out to him and told him what had happened, and she watched his jaw set in a way she had not seen before. "Who is Ray Cutter?" she asked. Harlan was quiet for a moment. "A man who sold me 20 head of cattle 2 years ago with a represented bill of sale," he said. Turned out the bill of sale was misrepresented. The cattle had been taken from another man's ranch 3 counties over. The rangers caught up with it last year. "I had to return the cattle which I'd already worked into my herd. And Cutter blames you for that," she said. "Cutter lost the money I paid him when the rangers tracked him down," Harlan said. "He spent time in jail and he came out with a grudge and a version of events that doesn't match the facts." Evelyn thought about this. "You need to tell the sheriff," she said. "Briggs knows about Cutter," Harlan said. "The history of it." "Then tell Briggs that Cutter came by," she said. "Today." "So there's a record of it." He looked at her. "You're right," he said. He went to town that afternoon and spoke with Sheriff Briggs, who was sober and attentive and noted it down in his record, and told Harlan that Cutter had been seen in the area and that he would ride out if Cutter came again. Cutter did not come again, as it turned out, at least not to the ranch. He left the Coldwater Creek area inside of 2 weeks, according to word that filtered through the town, moved on to whatever his next piece of dishonesty was going to be. And the threat passed the way many threats in that era passed, not in a dramatic confrontation, but in the simple mathematics of a man deciding another target was easier. But the episode had shifted something between Evelyn and Harlan, because when she had ridden out to the pasture to tell him, and he had listened and then said, "You're right," without hesitation or pride, and when she had watched him actually go to the sheriff without being argued into it, she understood that there was a trust between them now that had been built quietly over months of small things and had become load-bearing without either of them formally agreeing to it. February brought the first clear evidence that the Hereford cattle were thriving. 3 cows had calved, healthy calves that were on their feet quickly, and Harlan came in from the barn on the morning. The first one was born with mud on his coat, and an aliveness in his face that she had not seen there before. He came into the kitchen and stood there almost vibrating with it, this specific joy that was about new life on the land that was his to tend, and he said, "Come look." And she followed him out to the barn in her apron and her boots and looked over the stall rail at the new calf, copper-red and white-faced like its mother, unsteady on its legs in the way of new things. She was aware, standing beside Harlan at the stall rail in the smell of hay and warm animal and winter morning, that his shoulder was very close to hers, and that neither of them moved away. She was aware that he was looking at the calf and also looking at her looking at the calf, and that this double looking had become a thing that happened between them with increasing frequency, and that she was not imagining it. She was also aware that she had been here 3.5 months, and that the 2-week trial offer had expired about 3 months ago, and that no one had mentioned it since, which meant something. She turned from the stall and found him looking at her directly rather than at the calf, and for a moment neither of them said anything, and the morning light came through the gaps in the barn siding in pale winter lines, and somewhere outside a bird was singing the particular song birds sing in early February when they are testing the idea of spring. "Evelyn," he said, and stopped. "Harlan," she said, not to prompt him, just to give him back his name the way she had given Clara's name back to him on that first week, as a plain and honest acknowledgement. "I don't know exactly how to say the thing I want to say," he said. "I haven't said it to anyone in a long time, and I'm not sure I'm going to say it right." "Say it wrong then," she said. "I'll understand it." He took a breath. "I think I've been falling in love with you," he said, with the careful accuracy of a man checking his shot before he fires. "Not all at once. Gradually. The way you get used to a light being on in the house. One day you just realize you can't imagine the house dark anymore." She looked at him for a long moment, at the gray-green eyes that had been empty when she first came and were now so full of things she couldn't begin to count them. "That is not a bad way to say it," she said. "I'm aware you came here for work," he said. "And I'm aware that what I just said complicates the situation in ways that might not be—" "Harlan," she said. He stopped. "I have been here for 3.5 months," she said. "I have fixed your fence and cleaned your fireplace and reconciled your ledgers and ridden every cold morning across your pastures. I could have left after 2 weeks if I had wanted to." He was very still. "I didn't want to leave," she said. He put his hand on her face. Just his hand on her cheek, large and warm and calloused from years of work, gentle in a way that was its own kind of eloquence. And she put her own hand over his, and they stood like that in the barn, with the new calf behind them and the February light coming through the boards. And when he bent his head and kissed her, it was the kind of kiss that a person waits their whole life to understand. A kiss that said, "I am here and so are you," and that is the whole and sufficient miracle. The town of Coldwater Creek had more opinions about this development when it became apparent, which took about 3 weeks, because small towns have systems for detecting this kind of thing that are more reliable than telegraphs. Martha Peel came out to the ranch in a state of organized concern and sat at the kitchen table and looked at Evelyn with the expression of a woman who needs to ask a question without asking it directly. "You seem well," Martha said. "I am well," Evelyn said. "You seem particularly well," Martha said. "That's also true," Evelyn said and poured the coffee. Martha wrapped her hands around the tin cup. "People in town are talking," she said. "People in town have been talking since I arrived," Evelyn said. This is different talking. I know what kind of talking it is, Evelyn said. And I know what the answer to all of it is, which is that I am a grown woman and Harlan Dalton is a grown man, and we are both fully capable of conducting our own affairs. Martha looked at her for a long moment with the assessing look of someone who had known her since she was a child. "Are you happy?" she asked. Evelyn looked out the kitchen window at the yard, at the repaired fence and the swept porch and the new calves visible in the far pasture, and the smoke rising from the chimney that she had swept and cleaned, at the life that had been assembled here piece by piece through the long winter. "Yes," she said, "I am." March brought warmth back to the hill country, and with it the expansive feeling that always comes when winter releases its grip on the land. The cattle were doing well. 5 more calves had come, and all of them strong. Harlan had ridden to meet with a cattle broker from Austin, who had come through Coldwater Creek to look at what ranchers in the area were running. And the broker had shown considerable interest in the Hereford operation, and mentioned that there was a market opening up in the northern territories that was hungry for good beef cattle. Harlan came home from that meeting with the light in his eyes that she had first seen with the new calf in the barn, but broader now, turned toward the horizon rather than just the near pasture. He sat at the kitchen table that evening while she made supper, and he talked through everything the broker had said, and Evelyn listened and asked the questions that occurred to her, and at some point in the middle of this conversation Harlan stopped talking and just looked at her. "What?" she said. "I'm just thinking," he said. "About what?" "About the fact that 6 months ago I wasn't sure I was going to be here in the spring," he said. "Not in the sense of being ill, in the sense of having a reason to be." He said it plainly, without drama, the way he said most true things. "And now I'm sitting here talking about northern markets and I'm looking at you making supper and I can't quite account for the difference." Evelyn set down the spoon she was holding and turned to look at him fully. "You can't account for it," she said. "That's not entirely what I meant," he said. "I can account for the part that is you. I just can't account for the fact that you showed up." "I showed up because Pete Grayson has a loud mouth," she said. "Remind me to thank Pete Grayson," he said and smiled. She crossed the kitchen and put her hands on the table and leaned down and kissed him once, brief and warm, and then went back to the stove. He proposed in April. He did not make an elaborate occasion of it. He was not an elaborate man. They were on horseback in the south pasture in the late afternoon with the live oaks coming into their full spring leaf and the creek running high and clear from the March rains, and he pulled his horse up and she pulled hers up beside him and he said, "I want to ask you something." She looked at him. "I want to ask you to marry me," he said, "and I want to be clear that I know what I'm asking. I'm asking you to stay on a ranch that is still recovering, to build something with me that isn't finished being built. I don't have a great deal to offer you except the land and the work and whatever I am, which you already know better than most people have." She thought about the fact that she had arrived with a carpet bag and $4.30 and the willingness to stay when everyone else had gone. She thought about what she had found here, not the wealth or the easy life or the security she'd supposed she was looking for when she left San Antonio, but something she hadn't known she was looking for, this specific man and this specific land and the specific quality of a life that was real in all its parts. "Yes," she said, "I'll marry you." He reached across the space between their horses and took her hand, and held it, and they sat there in the south pasture in the April afternoon, with the creek running and the cattle in the distance and the live oaks full of new leaves. And it was not a fairy story, and it was not a fortune, and it was not the easiest possible thing, but it was true, and that was worth more than all the easier alternatives she had never chosen. They were married in May, at the finished enough church in Coldwater Creek, on a morning when the wildflowers were at the extravagant height of their Texas bloom, the bluebonnets and Indian paintbrush and evening primrose making the roadsides look like something a dreamer had imagined, and the land had agreed to become. Pastor Yates kept the sermon appropriately brief, because Evelyn had requested this politely, but with enough firmness that he understood it was not a negotiating position. Martha was there in her good dress, pink-faced with pleasure. Pete Grayson from the feed store was there, and shook Harlan's hand with the proprietary satisfaction of a man who has contributed something to an outcome. Sheriff Briggs came, which was a testament to his basic goodness rather than his social diligence, since he was not a church-going man by inclination. Harlan wore a clean shirt and his best vest, and had his hair cut for the occasion by the barber on Main Street. And when Evelyn walked down the short aisle toward him, he was standing at the front of the church with his hat in his hands, and a look on his face that she recognized as a man who is looking at the thing he cannot believe he gets to have. She stood beside him and they said the words, the old words, the words that had been used in that form for centuries because they contain the weight of what they are promising. And when it was done and they walked out of the church into the full blazing Texas May morning, she felt the difference between the woman who had ridden into Coldwater Creek with $4.30 and the woman she was now, which was not a difference in circumstances so much as a difference in belonging. She belonged somewhere now. She belonged to this, and this belonged to her. The celebration was modest and genuine. A supper at the town hall organized by Martha and the other women of the social committee, with good food and a fiddle player named Old Sam Greer, who was partially deaf in one ear which affected his tuning, but not his enthusiasm. And people danced on the wooden floor until late in the evening. And Harlan danced with Evelyn with the careful attention of a man who is doing something he does not do often and is determined to do it right. He was not a natural dancer, she was not either. They were clumsy in the way of two people who are more comfortable with work than performance, and they stepped on each other's feet twice and laughed both times, and the laughing was better than any graceful dancing would have been. The fiddle player struck up a slow song toward the end of the evening, something old and sweet that Evelyn didn't know the name of, and Harlan put his hand on her back, and she put her head against his shoulder, and they swayed rather than danced, just moving with the music in the simple way of people who have stopped performing and started simply being, and she could feel the steadiness of him, the solidity that had been there from the start underneath all that grief and damage. The particular quality of a person who had been built to last even when everything was trying to wear them down. They drove home to the ranch in the wagon under the late May stars, and the valley was warm and dark and full of cricket sound, and the house was lit from inside because Martha had been out earlier to light the lamps, and as they came down the track toward it, Evelyn thought that this was what the word home meant when you understood it from the inside. Summer at the Spur and Stone Ranch was full and hard and good in the way that full, hard, good things are when you are present enough to feel them. Harlan hired 2 hands in June, young men from town, one named Del Briggs, the sheriff's nephew, who was 18 and hard-working and somewhat scared of cattle but determined not to show it, and one named Vicent Sandoval, 20 years old, who had come to Texas from a ranching family in Coahuila just south of the border and knew cattle the way some people know music, intuitively and completely. Vicent had been in the territory for 3 years and spoke English with precision and a slight formal quality that came from having learned it from textbooks before he learned it from conversation. Harlan treated both young men with the same steady fairness that was his nature, the same fairness that had always been there, and had simply been buried under the rubble of his grief. He was not an easy boss in the sense of being lenient, but he was fair and he was consistent, and he taught rather than simply ordered, and both Del and Vicent responded to this with the loyalty that young men give to bosses who treat them as capable rather than as obstacles. The ranch was recovering. Not quickly, not dramatically, but in the way that real recovery happens, steadily and through accumulated effort. The herd was growing. The calves from the spring were strong and would be ready to sell in the fall. Harlan had a meeting in July with the broker from Austin who had expressed interest in the Hereford operation, and the meeting resulted in a commitment for a fall sale that would service a significant portion of the bank loan and leave enough to purchase additional breeding stock for the following year. Evelyn kept the house and the accounts and rode out most mornings to the pastures, And in the evening she and Harlan sat on the porch they had repaired together in June, the warped boards replaced and the porch railing solid now, and watched the summer light go out of the sky over the limestone ridge. And sometimes they talked, and sometimes they were quiet, and both were good. She told him in August that she was expecting a child. She told him in the morning, at the kitchen table over coffee, because she was not a woman who made more occasion of things than they needed. She said, "Harlan, I'm going to have a baby," and watched his face. He set down his coffee cup very carefully. He looked at her with an expression that she had not seen on him before, something beyond the relief and the warmth and the love she knew, something larger and more complex, layered with the grief that would always be part of him and the joy that was new and growing, and his eyes were bright in a way that was not entirely composed. "When?" he said. "February or March, I think," she said. "It's early yet." He reached across the table and took her hand in both of his the way he had taken it in the south pasture when she said yes, and held it with the careful intensity of a man holding something he understands the fragility and the miracle of. "Are you well?" he said. "Are you feeling all right?" "I'm feeling very well," she said. "A little tired in the mornings, otherwise fine." He nodded and was quiet for a moment and then said, "I want to be better at this than I've been at some other things." And she understood what he meant, which was that he was thinking about what it meant to be a father and what kind of man he needed to be for that. And she understood also that he was going to be good at it because the qualities it required: steadiness, patience, the willingness to show up every day regardless of whether you felt like it, were qualities he had in abundance. "You're going to be excellent at it," she said. "You don't know that," he said. "I know you," she said. The fall came and the cattle sale went as well as the broker had promised. 32 heads sold at a good price, and the income from the sale cleared most of the bank debt and left them in a position that was not prosperity exactly, but was real and sustainable, which is its own kind of freedom. Harlan rode into town to pay the bank and came home with something settled in his face, a finality to the worst of the worry, not its complete absence but its reduction to a manageable scale. He also came back with a rocking chair tied to the wagon, a beautiful piece of work that he'd commissioned from a furniture maker in town, high-backed and smooth, with curved runners and arm rests that fit the hands. He carried it up to the porch without explanation and set it in the spot that got the most afternoon light, and Evelyn stood in the doorway and looked at it. "For you," he said. "For later when your back is tired." She looked at him and at the rocking chair and at the afternoon light on the porch, at all of it together. "Thank you, Harlan," she said. "It has a good weight to it," he said. "It won't tip easy." "No," she agreed. "It won't." The winter was mild compared to the previous year, and Evelyn moved through the later months of her pregnancy with the same practical steadiness she brought to everything. She rested when she needed to and worked when she could, and let Harlan fuss over her in the careful way of a man who is not a natural fusser, but has decided this is a situation that requires it. He drove her into town to see the doctor twice, a quiet man named Dr. Aldridge, who had been in Coldwater Creek for 15 years and delivered more than half the children currently living within 20 miles, and Dr. Aldridge pronounced her healthy and the pregnancy progressing normally, and told Harlan that worrying in proportion was advisable, but worrying beyond proportion was just suffering by appointment, which was the kind of dry practical wisdom that Harlan responded to. The baby came in the last week of February. It was a long night, the kind of long night that is timeless in the way of the most important things, when the hours stop being countable and become instead a single sustained experience. Martha was there and Dr. Aldridge was there, and Harlan sat in the main room through the long hours with the particular helpless vigilance of a man who can do very little except be present, and Del Briggs and Vicent Sandoval, who had been finishing the evening work in the barn when the doctor's buggy arrived, sat quietly on the porch steps in the cold February night in a kind of informal solidarity. The baby arrived in the small hours before dawn, and it was a boy. Dr. Aldridge put him in Harlan's arms 10 minutes later, and Harlan stood in the lamplight of the bedroom doorway holding his son, this small, red-faced, absolutely furious person who had just arrived in the world with strong opinions about the experience, and looked at Evelyn in the bed with her eyes tired and her face open in a way he had never seen it, which was the look of a woman who has been through something that has rearranged her and is still finding her arrangement. "He's healthy," Harlan said. His voice was not quite steady. "He's very loud," she said, which was true. The baby was conducting his feelings at full volume. "He gets that from you," Harlan said. She laughed, which was not something she had expected to be able to do at that particular moment, and reached her arms out. And he came and sat on the edge of the bed and put the baby into her arms, and she held him, this person who had been 10 minutes in the world, and felt the weight of him, the specific warm weight of her child. "What do we call him?" Harlan said. She had thought about this. "James," she said. "After your father, if that's all right." Harlan was quiet for a moment, and she felt him absorb the gift of it, the thing she had given him by choosing that name. "That's more than all right," he said. So the boy was James Thomas Dalton, Thomas being Evelyn's father's name, and he came into the world hollering and warm-blooded and full of immediate needs. And his parents looked at him and at each other in the lamplight, and the whole long journey of the past year and a half was present in that room with them. The grief and the fence posts, and the apple pie and the bean stew, and the February morning in the barn and the south pasture and the slow dance, and all the mornings on horseback in the cold. All of it present, and all of it arrived here at this particular point. This baby and this room and these two people. James grew the way healthy babies grow, in rapid, inexplicable surges that leave you marveling at the efficiency of life. He had Evelyn's dark eyes and Harlan's square jaw, and opinions of his own from the very beginning. He was a busy baby, and then a busy toddler, and then a busy small boy who wanted to be wherever the work was happening, and who had a special attachment to Vicent Sandoval, because Vicent was patient with small children, and taught him the Spanish words for the names of things, which James learned with an enthusiasm that delighted Vicent and somewhat alarmed the ladies at the church. Del Briggs stayed on at the ranch and grew from a nervous 18-year-old into a capable 20-year-old cowhand who knew the Hereford herd nearly as well as Harlan did. He got himself a girl from town in the second year and spent his days off walking out with her, and the domestic satisfaction this seemed to give him made him an even better worker, which Harlan noted with the quiet approval of a man who has learned to let young people find their own way. The ranch became prosperous. Not wealthy, not in the fashion of the great cattle barons whose names were beginning to be attached to the railroad contracts and the northern markets, but prosperous in the real and grounded way of a land that is well managed by people who understand it. The herd grew steadily. The fencing was maintained. The house got a proper window in the room that had been Evelyn's first quarters and which was now James's room, and then later, when James was 3, a second child arrived. This one was a girl. She came in a late summer evening with less drama than her brother, as if she had considered the logistics and decided efficiency was preferable. She was small and calm from the first, with Harlan's gray-green eyes that were so striking in her small, dark-haired face that people in town would stop to look at her in the mercantile and marvel at the color of them. They named her Ruth Clara Dalton, and Harlan said Clara's name himself this time, with a steadiness he had not had when Evelyn had said it in the first week, a grief that had been metabolized and made part of him rather than something apart from him. And Evelyn thought that this was what healing looked like when it was real, not the absence of the loss, but the ability to carry it without being crushed. James adored his sister with the fierce and slightly overbearing love that firstborn children bring to the arrival of a sibling. He was 4 years old, and entirely convinced that his job was to explain the world to Ruth and also to protect her from all of it, which he attempted to do from the first day with such dedicated incompetence that it was impossible not to find him wonderful. The years turned. The Spur and Stone Ranch became a name that meant something in that part of Texas, not through legend or drama, but through the simple accumulation of years of honest work and fair dealing. Harlan sold cattle at fair prices and paid his debts on time, and treated the people who worked for him with the same steadiness he brought to everything. And this turned out, as it usually does when practiced consistently, to be enough to build a reputation on. Vicent Sandoval stayed for 5 years and then returned to Coahuila to take over his family's ranch when his father's health declined, leaving with a handshake and a formality that was the highest form of respect he knew how to express. And Harlan shook his hand and told him that the spur and stone had been better for his time there, which was simply and entirely true. Del Briggs got married to his girl from town, a young woman named Anna Whitmore, daughter of the bank manager, which explained some things about his diligence. He and Anna had a small house at the edge of the property that Harlan helped him build, and Del became not just a ranch hand, but something more like a partner in the day-to-day running of the operation, which was an arrangement that worked well for everyone and freed Harlan to do the kind of planning and relationship building that a growing operation required. The bank loan was paid off completely in the fall of the 5th year of their marriage, and Harlan came home from Whitmore's bank with the paid-off note in his breast pocket and handed it to Evelyn at the kitchen table, and she held it and read it and handed it back to him and said, "I think this calls for cinnamon apple pie." "Yes," he said, "it does." She made the pie with dried apples and cinnamon, the way she had promised in that very first winter when he had told her about Clara's version, and they ate it at the kitchen table in the evening while James, who was now 5, tried to bargain for a third piece and was unsuccessful, and Ruth, who was 1, was absorbed in the serious project of getting corn off a cob and onto herself, and the lamp was bright on the table, and the evening sounds came through the open window. The creek and the insects and the cattle in the distant pasture, and Harlan looked at Evelyn across the table with all of it around them. "I never thanked you properly," he said, "for coming out here that first day." "You've thanked me," she said. "Not properly," he said, "because I didn't understand yet what it had cost you. You came here with nothing and I gave you very little to start with and you stayed anyway." "I didn't come with nothing," she said. "I came with everything I needed." He looked at her. "What did you have?" "Patience," she said simply, "and I was willing to use it." He was quiet for a moment and then he said, "I heard what people said in town when you first came out here. I heard that people said I would never get right again, that the ranch was finished and I was finished with it." "I know what people said," she said. "Did you believe it?" She considered this honestly because she was an honest woman. "I believed you were in a very bad place," she said. "I did not believe it was permanent, but I didn't come out here because I was certain you would be all right. I came out here because you needed help and I needed work and it seemed like a thing worth trying." "And," he said, "and I found out that sometimes the thing worth trying turns out to be the whole of your life," she said. He reached across the table and took her hand, and James seized this moment of parental distraction to make his third piece of pie bid, which was still unsuccessful because Evelyn had a sixth sense for these things and blocked the maneuver without releasing Harlan's hand or looking up from his face. "Mama," James said, aggrieved. "The pie is for tomorrow," she said. "That's what you said yesterday," he said. "And yet there was still pie today," she said. "Think about that." James thought about it with the focused intensity of a 5-year-old encountering a logical problem, and this bought them another full minute. Harlan laughed, and Evelyn laughed with him, and Ruth laughed because the other two were laughing, which was her standard policy on laughter. And outside the Texas night was full and warm, and the stars over the limestone ridge were as bright as they had been on every night that had preceded this one, as bright as they would be on every night that followed. The porch that they had repaired together got a second rocking chair eventually, because Harlan decided that if Evelyn had one for her tired back then, he ought to have one for the evenings. And so they sat side by side on the porch in the good weather, which was most of the weather in that part of Texas, and watched the valley and the cattle and the children and the light change on the ridge. And it was the kind of contentment that people sometimes mistake for the absence of things, and is actually the presence of everything that matters. James grew into a boy who loved the land the way his father did, with the specific and practical love of someone who intends to work it his whole life. He learned to ride young and well, and by the time he was 8 he could assist with the cattle work in the way that children assist with things they are serious about, not as decoration but as genuine if limited help. He was Harlan's shadow on the ranch, the way Harlan had been his own father's shadow once. And when Harlan taught him things about the land and the cattle, he did it with the same patient specificity that had been taught to him, the knowledge passing from hand to hand the way good knowledge does. Ruth was different from her brother in almost every particular. Where James was direct and outdoor-bound, Ruth was observant and quiet and had Harlan's love of books, sitting on the porch with the same focused absorption that Evelyn had demonstrated when reading Hawthorne by lamplight, though Ruth's preferences ran toward anything she could get her hands on. She also had a gift for drawing, filling the margins of every piece of paper in the house with small, precise pictures of cattle and horses, and the view from the porch toward the ridge, pictures that showed she was seeing the world with the attention of someone who intends to remember it. Evelyn taught her to read herself rather than waiting for the school year, sitting with her at the kitchen table in the early afternoons the way her own mother had sat with her, working through the alphabet, and then simple words and then sentences, and Ruth absorbed it with the rapid pleasure of someone who has been waiting for exactly this skill. The year that James turned 10 and Ruth turned 6, a third child came, another boy, who arrived in the spring and was named William, after no one in particular, but a name that both of them had separately mentioned at different times, and then discovered they had both mentioned it, which seemed like a sufficient reason. William was from the very first a sociable and cheerful child who treated the world as a satisfactory arrangement and intended to cooperate with it fully. He laughed early and often, and had Evelyn's dark eyes and her practical cast of mind, and a disposition so reliably sunny that the whole household seemed lighter for it. James regarded him with the senior authority of a 10-year-old, and considered it his responsibility to teach William everything important, which was a project that would take many years and kept James productively occupied. The decade turned. The 1880s arrived in Coldwater Creek with the railroad coming through the county, which changed the town considerably, bringing new people and new commerce and the particular energy of connection to a larger world. The cattle business changed with it, the markets broadening and the prices becoming more stable and predictable, which was both good and somewhat less adventurous. Harlan watched the changes with the measured attention of a man who had learned to be present to whatever era he was actually living in rather than mourning the one that had preceded it. He and Evelyn rode out together still most mornings, the habit of it too embedded by now to be anything but a fact of their life together. The horses they rode now were not the ones she had borrowed from her uncle in San Antonio and eventually purchased when she had money enough for it. Those horses were long gone, replaced by better ones, well-bred and well-kept, and the morning rides were different now than they had been in the cold first winter, more comfortable in every physical sense and differently comfortable in the human sense, the ease of two people who have been alongside each other so long that the space between them has become a known and comfortable dimension. They talked on those rides about the ranch and the children and the news from town, and the books they were reading and anything else that occurred to them. And sometimes they talked about things that had happened years ago, the first fence they had fixed together, the new calf in the barn, the apple pie with the cinnamon, the things that had laid the foundation of what they were. And these conversations had the particular warmth of old stories that have been well loved by the telling. One morning in October of 1885, 7 years into their marriage, they rode out to the south pasture in the early light, the fall being well along now, and the live oaks beginning to turn in the way they turn in that part of Texas, more golden than the reds of the north, a warm and honey-colored fall. They stopped the horses on the rise above the south pasture the way they had stopped on a spring day 7 years before when Harlan had said the thing he didn't know how to say, and said it anyway. Below them, the Hereford cattle were moving through the morning light in that slow, purposeful way cattle have, and the creek was visible beyond the pasture, and the ridge beyond that, and the whole familiar geography of the place was laid out in front of them like a picture of something that had been imagined and then made real through years of effort. "I was thinking about something," Harlan said. "Tell me," she said. "I was thinking about what you said at the kitchen table," he said. "About coming here with patience and it being enough." "I remember saying it," she said. "I've thought about it a lot since then," he said, "about what it cost you. To be patient with a person who was not easy to be patient with." "You were not so difficult," she said. "Evelyn," he said, with the particular tone that meant he knew she was being generous and appreciated it and was going to insist on the truth anyway. She smiled. "You were some difficult," she said. "I was very difficult," he said. "And you stayed anyway, not because you were certain it would work out, not because I deserved it or earned it. Just because you decided it was worth trying, and then you kept deciding every morning." She looked at him in the morning light, at the face she had known now through 7 years of mornings and evenings, and the full spectrum of what a life contained, the grief and the work and the joy and the children and the seasons and the ordinary extraordinary fact of two people choosing each other over and over. "That's what love is," she said. "It isn't the one moment of deciding. It's deciding every morning." He reached across and took her hand the way he always did, and she held his hand the way she always did. And below them the cattle moved through the golden light and the creek ran, and the live oaks held their warm color against the blue October sky. And the Spur and Stone Ranch was alive and whole and full. And the woman who had ridden into Coldwater Creek with $4.30 and a willingness to stay had stayed. And the man who everyone said would never get right again had gotten right. Not because the grief had left him, but because the life had come back around it, filling the spaces that grief had cleared, and because someone had shown up and been patient when patience was the only thing that was going to work. That was the story that Pete Grayson told at the Dusty Boot Saloon for the rest of his life, embellished somewhat with each telling in the way of good stories. How Evelyn Easton had ridden into town with nothing but determination, and gone out to the Spur and Stone Ranch that everyone had written off, and the man that everyone had written off, and how what she had offered was not money or connections or particular beauty, though she had her own kind of beauty, but patience, which is the hardest thing to offer because it asks nothing in return and gives everything anyway. And people would nod when Pete told it, people who had watched it happen from the outside, and people who had only heard about it later, because it was the kind of story that was true in the way that the best stories are true, not just in its facts, but in what it understood about people. That some people are worth waiting for. That some things worth having require a long and patient hand. That a life can be broken past what anyone expects it to survive and still, given time and the right company, find its way back to something new and whole and good. The children grew. The ranch endured. The mornings kept coming. And every single one of them, the man and the woman who had made this life together, rode out into the south pasture in the early light, because some habits, once they become part of you, are not habits anymore. They are just who you are.